hardware, but a lot of it is subjectivity, it's culture, it's agency, because it's education, insurance, the law, Hollywood, psychology, it's services. And so one of the remarkable changes we're seeing is a shift in the way in which labour operates internationally in industrial forms, manufacturing forms, and the way labour operates culturally in service forms. Now, of course, there's some interchange between the two, but the long-standing processes going back over 50 years in manufacturing are quite rapidly becoming true in these service sectors as well. So what that might mean, this is where I'll conclude, is that in terms of a future utopia or dystopia, one way in which that gets worked out is what happens when, instead of having a fairly restive, dissatisfied and unsuccessful national working class, you have a fairly restive, unsatisfied and unhappy middle to upper class that's highly educated, has high levels of cultural capital, and is used to a sense of security. And that's why you get the emergence, particularly in Europe, to a certain extent in Japan, of this precariat movement amongst people involved in cultural labour.
This is a question to both of you, really kind of a juxtaposition of your two talks. Toby talked about economic citizenship and the problem presented by the growth ethic. You talked about the bubbles as these periodic occurrences within capitalism that are expansive moments of capitalism. In many ways, of course, they're facilitated by states, land bubbles, the railroad bubble, so forth, lots of state facilitation. But when you come to the good globalization and the problem of the growth ethic, can either of you imagine a capitalism that isn't based on expanding markets? I think that's the crux of it, really. The crux of, going back to Dupuy's talk this morning, really, about cycles of violence and resources. So I think it's a central question, and I'm not saying we should try to answer it tonight, but I'd like to hear what you all have to say about it.
Well, I think it certainly is possible, although it's not necessarily the way people think about it. So I would say that if you sort of, I think one could differentiate what one could call extensive versus intensive growth. And you could say extensive growth is you do more, you create more output with more input. So more oil, more energy, more labor, and maybe if all else fails, more borrowing, and you sort of get more on the output side. Whereas I think you could sort of describe intensive growth as getting more with less, where it involves some kinds of genuine innovations where you're able to do more with less. I think one of the challenges is that these are not being differentiated at all. And obviously, for example, in the United States, an awful lot of the growth has been extremely extensive. I think just about sort of the urban sprawl that's taken place over the last 50, 60 years is extremely extensive. And probably, I tend to think that good globalization will have a much higher amount of intensive growth and much less extensive growth than we've seen.
There are all kinds of technical reasons why you need to have economies growing, as we know, particularly when you move away from familial or village-based notions of security, not just military security, as it were, security from violence, but security from the ravages of age and ill health. We have to have growing economies, we have to have substitution rates and so on in populations in order to have things like social security. And not just social security, but privatized systems of that as well. In addition, although I was obviously pushing an anti-growth position, I'm also aware that that anti-growth position has been used in the past to attack natality, to attack women's right to reproduce. It's been used to attack wages by calling for wage restraint. It's been used to attack immigration there are all kinds of activities that I wouldn't want to associate with, that you get associated with the idea of being anti-growth. All the problems of zero population growth and so forth. At the same time, I guess I do want us to question the power of the metaphor to govern all areas of life. And I think that there's this question of what happens when you do commodify everyday life. You just make everything debt serviceable. Almost everything becomes monetized. At that point, you ask, what aspects of life are on the table for us to put into a relatively non-commodified sphere of life where we have other kinds of exchange? And that's perhaps my biggest fear about the commodification of the everyday, that we end up being unable to think outside a growth model, apart from, in these, in my opinion, deeply regressive ways, with reference to natality, immigration, and wages.
Here's Martin for San Francisco. First, a comment and a question for you. When I graduated from undergrad, I volunteered at the Jesuit missionary corps. When I got into Jalapa, Veracruz, Mexico, in the middle of the jungle, there was not missionary work. We were building homes and that kind of work. But we did have classes, and I remember being reported to the pastor, St. Martin, who was promoting ambitions that were not necessary. So I was trying to motivate. I would tell them you got to be more motivated to desire more. And they didn't think that was very nice. They want more than what they had. They were quite content. The other question, the question I have for both of you, is there such a thing as responsible capitalism?
Well, I don't know to what extent Peter's involved in this, but I'm sure you're very aware of corporate social responsibility as an ethos. And of course, that's become a bit of a standard in the mantra of many large corporations. If you write to the Ford Motor Company and you ask them for it, you can be sent their annual corporate social responsibility reports. The Prince of Wales, someone bless him, has a CSR model. Of course, the United Nations under Kofi Annan instituted a CSR model. And this corporate social responsibility is sometimes seen as entirely unself-interested, and at other times seen as creating new business opportunities as well. Clearly, the whole idea of microcredit, ideas of various forms of business-oriented philanthropy suggest that, yes, that can happen. And there's no doubt that when you get a collectivist ethos, I think all kinds of good things can occur. I would say I say this as an unrepentantly secular person, one of the problems that that are facing many in Latin America now is actually the decline of notions of solidarity that came with Catholicism and their displacement by ideas of a much more individual nature that come with many of the newer evangelical activities there. At the same time, I'd say that a lot of what Catholicism brought with it, capitalism can also bring with it, which is not actually about the ratiocinity of calculating a nomic, monadic individual. It's actually about ideas of solidarity and collectivity, which is really what much of corporate life is about. It's not just about being an individual. It's about collective, purposive activity. And I think that when capitalism operates like that, there are all sorts of positive aspects to it. And let's face it, as an old leftist, I'd have to say it's the most revolutionary form of social organization we've had.
I would say, I think that, let me answer the question more negatively, which is that, I don't, if you can't have a responsible form of capitalism, I'm not exactly sure what the alternative is, even though this may just reflect a failure of imagination on my part. It is my sense that you can't have a system where the rules are set so perfectly that even if people act like devils, they will all be nice to each other because you have just the right rules. I don't think that actually is possible. And so I do think there's sort of there's a cultural component to this. There's a component to where you have a company that can't treat people too badly, and it looks badly if it does.